The Director General, other senior officials of All India Radio and Prasar Bharati, and distinguished members of the audience. It is a humbling thought for me to be present here to deliver the Sardar Patel Memorial Lecture, which has attained a status, coveted status I should say, in the calendar of important lectures that are organized every year in this country. My humility is greater when I just saw the list of speakers who have delivered this address. It is a who's who of Indian society, starting with, as just mentioned by DG, Sri C. Rajagopalachari, India's first Indian Governor General and a doyen of Indian thought and intellect. From there to scholars like Dr. Zakir Hussain and Justice H.R. Khanna. I mean, how many names do I take? Dr. Karan Singh and Mr. N.A. Palkhiwala, Dr. A.P.J. Abdul Kalam and Montek Singh Ahluwalia. It's really a who's who. And to be here to deliver the lecture in memory of one of the greatest men born in India is truly a humbling thought. I pay my deepest tribute to the memory of Sardar Patel on this occasion of his birth anniversary. We are also here to pay tribute to the memory of Sardar Patel, a legend in his own lifetime, and the architect of the present territorial definition of India. Besides his stellar role as one of the greatest fighters for India's independence and a stalwart of the Indian National Congress, confidant of Mahatma Gandhi, Sardar Patel will always be remembered for establishing, in practice, the idea of India. He united more than 560 princely states into the Indian Union, mostly through persuasion, but did not hesitate to order police action against a few powerful princes, such as the Nizam of Hyderabad. Each time you look at the map of India, you should remember the towering figure of Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, the soft-spoken, self-effacing crusader for India and Indianness. The map of India is itself a monument to the great Sardar's memory. With these words, I come to the subject today, which is not about Sardar Patel, because the Patel Memorial Lecture is not meant to be about Sardar Patel. It is a lecture in his memory on diverse subjects, from science to arts to humanities to technology, to set a benchmark for contemporary Indian thought. And in this context, I am grateful and honored that I have been asked to speak on a complex but I think essential subject in today's context: socialism, Marxism, and integral humanism. I think it is important because Indian political and social philosophy has never received the kind of acclaim that it deserves in the schema, worldwide schema of politics and philosophy. Integral humanism, authored by Pandit Deen Dayal Upadhyay, is hardly ever taught in our curriculum. It is not known outside a few institutions, it is not part of the curriculum, and it does not lay adequate emphasis in our educational scheme of things. This is not the only case. Even the teachings of great sages, Indian sages, including Swami Vivekananda, does not get the same kind of attention because our course curricula, to a great extent, is still determined by Western science and Western scholarship. I think the time has come to make a break because India, it is said, is aspiring to be a knowledge society. I disagree. India is a knowledge society. Our ancient sages, our philosophers, imparted on the world the kind of knowledge the rest of the world could not. I'm not saying this as a boast or as a jingoistic idea. But yes, India has been bestowed with great minds and great intellect, and the philosophical body of ideas that have emanated from India is second to none, considering how much has been contributed by Indian philosophers and thinkers. Their ideas have not received the kind of international recognition and appreciation as many other ideas have. So the time has come to place, at least at par, I'm not denigrating other ideas or Western notions, but at least Indian philosophers' ideas must be taught and disseminated worldwide in the same way as thoughts and ideas of other philosophers from other countries is disseminated. So in that context, ladies and gentlemen, today I intend to focus first on integral humanism because so little is actually known about it or discussed. And as I said, that although I'm not going to talk about the life of Sardar Patel, I will talk about the times of Sardar Patel. You say, when you say life and times of somebody, you discuss not only that person's personal experience or contribution, but also the times in which he or she was born and worked. Now, what shaped Sardar's mind and thoughts, I believe, were a lot of invisible currents of ideas and philosophies that he experienced and internalized. I'm here to talk to you about the interplay of ideas that swirled around people in the latter half of the 19th century. When Sardar Patel was studying to become a barrister at the Middle Temple Inn in London during the early years of the 20th century, and incidentally, he topped the examinations for Middle Temple Bar despite not having any previous college education. When he was studying there, the world was in the midst of an intellectual turmoil. There was growing resentment against the exploitative nature of capitalism, which in turn had spawned imperialism. Much of the world in Asia and Africa was in colonial bondage. Thinkers of the time were convinced that without the destruction, or at least modification, of the capitalist system, humanity could not be emancipated. The dominant ideologies opposing capitalism were socialism and communism. Communism, which was largely shaped by the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Their philosophy sought to codify the struggle of the industrial working class in Europe. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917 added a new dimension to this struggle. However, the revolution in pre-industrial, largely agrarian Russia led to major complications and distortions in the practical implementation of socialism. This resulted in a perverted interpretation of the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The communist parties that emerged in that period abjured democratic ideals and resulted in a dictatorial system, first in Russia and thereafter in every other European country where half-baked revolutions occurred. At the intellectual plane, however, the debate between socialism and Marxism was still raging. In Western Europe, for example, socialist parties did not conform to the idea of the violent overthrow of governments through a proletarian revolution. They were looking for various democratic alternatives. In Russia, however, Joseph Stalin set up a harsh dictatorial regime, straying away from the principles proposed by the father of the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. In other parts of the world, altogether different philosophical explorations were incubating. In India, nationalist ideas were resurgent, and intellectuals were seeking to explore India's glorious past in order to chart a path for the future. While Mahatma Gandhi believed that India's destiny lay in the self-sufficient village community, or Gram Swaraj, other thinkers sought to construct a body of ideas that offered an alternative to both capitalism and socialism by stressing the essence of the individual in creating a harmonious society, away from the conflict between man and man inherent in capitalist, socialist, and Marxist approaches. Thinkers like Swami Dayanand Saraswati, Rabindranath Tagore, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Swami Vivekananda, and many others sought to script an Indian philosophical narrative based on ancient scriptures such as the Vedas and the Upanishads. It is in succession to these wide-ranging philosophical ideas, deriving practical lessons from contemporary history, besides the experience of struggle against colonial rule, that Pandit Deen Dayal Upadhyay expounded the thesis of integral humanism as an answer to prevailing social conflict. In light of this preamble, let me lead you through some of the thoughts and ideas of Pandit Deen Dayal Upadhyay to explain the idea of integral humanism. But before that, let me again place the context in which we are talking about this subject. In recent times, it is intellectually fashionable in some circles to proclaim that the age of isms is over, that after nearly 2 centuries of struggle between conflicting ideologies, humanity has settled for an ideological equilibrium. Some would say capitalism has won the day, that market forces alone determine the course of human history. Hence, in a sense, history is shaped by the market alone. Others may not agree with this simplistic formulation, but the preponderant view today appears to be that isms do not matter anymore, as the conflict between contending isms has virtually come to an end. When Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History, there was a similar surge in opinion that with the end of the Cold War, the ideological conflicts that had dominated much of the 20th century had ended, and since the history of humanity is the history of conflict, history itself has come to an end. This postulation, however, was quickly challenged by Fukuyama's teacher, Samuel P. Huntington, who argued that religious identities would determine the shape of conflicts in the post-Cold War era. His book, The Clash of Civilizations, posited the Judeo-Christian, that is Euro-American civilization against the Islamic civilizational construct. The struggle between ideologies, as hitherto understood, was supplanted by the two principal religious orders of the modern world, with other religious structures lining up behind one or the other. Many scholars have challenged the clash of civilizations model of explaining contemporary global realities. Critics argue that postmodern conflicts based on religious identity can never replace the ideological battle between the two political economic systems, that is, capitalist and socialist. Indeed, although the sharpness of the conflict has reduced significantly, with the capitalist world order gaining the upper hand and the socialist communist model collapsing all but in name, the philosophies underlying these models continue to be the major theoretical basis of interpreting human society and systems of government. In my view, the so-called clash of civilizations has existed in some form or another ever since Islamic and Christian religious beliefs became fully developed bodies of ideas and practices. In conflict to each other, they heralded the crusades of medieval age. The conflict may not have been resolved yet, but religious faith and human identity cannot re-emerge as the principal contradiction in the postmodern world in which we live. I assert this because religious texts can hardly help explain contemporary socio-economic contradictions or locate solutions to them. Therefore, later politico-philosophical constructs, particularly Marxism, socialism, and integral humanism, are ideologies that attempt to interpret and lay down practical blueprints for a better, according to them, more harmonious and inclusive society that religious ideas, by their very nature, cannot create. Religions are by nature exclusivist. In other words, there is no place for a non-believer in a religion's belief structure. On the other hand, isms based on philosophies are essentially secular and seek to win adherents across diverse religious groups. It is in the context of this contemporary conflict or post-World War that I urge you to look at the concept of philosophy of integral humanism as laid down by Pandit Deen Dayal Upadhyay. He said, democracy, equality, national independence, and world peace are interrelated concepts. But in the West, these concepts have often clashed with one another. The ideas of socialism and one world government have stemmed from efforts at resolving this conflict. However, they have not only failed to do so, but have weakened some of these concepts and created new problems. Bharatiya Sanskriti offers the philosophical substratum on the basis of which these concepts can be harmonized and cherished objectives realized. In the absence of such a basis, human thought and development have become stultified. The basic truths propounded by Bharatiya Sanskriti have validated beyond country and age. So, knowledge of these truths will provide a direction not only for our own advancement, but for the world's progress as a whole. The outlook of Bharatiya Sanskriti is integral. It accepts the seeming differences among various entities and aspects of life, but it seeks at the same time to discover the unity underlying them and takes an integrated view of the whole scene. In the manifold activities of the world, Bharatiya Sanskriti sees interdependence, cooperation, and concord rather than conflict, contradiction, and discord. Let me repeat this. In the manifold activities of the world, Bharatiya Sanskriti sees interdependence, cooperation, and concord rather than conflict, contradiction, and discord. Its perspective is all-comprehensive, not partial. It wishes and works for the well-being of all. Integralism is thus the keynote. Several ideologies of the West are based on the assumption that there is an inherent conflict between the individual and society. These ideologies then take up the cause either of one or the other. But the fact is that there is no such inherent conflict between the two entities, that is, individual and
All India
society.
Radio
The
Archives
visible
recording.
entity, the individual, is also the representative of the invisible society. It is through him that the society manifests itself. He is, in fact, the chief instrument of society and the measure of its fulfillment. Destruction or constriction of his individuality will leave the society stunted. A flower is what it is because of its petals, and the worth of the petals lies in remaining with the flower and adding to its beauty. Development of the individual and social good are not contradictory interests. An individual is the aggregate of body, mind, intellect, and soul. Anyone desirous of all-round progress of the individual must keep in mind all these attributes of his. All of them need to be satisfied. Only then would an individual experience real happiness. This means that both material as well as spiritual progress are to be aimed at. The wherewithals for fulfilling these fourfold wants are material means, peace, enlightenment, and a feeling of tadatma, identification. It is the comprehensive nature of this aim which inspires the individual to exert for social good. The four purusharths of dharma, artha, kama, and moksha have been conceived as means for the achievement of this twin objective of individual advancement and social welfare. Dharma, artha, and kama sustain one another and are complementary. To accept any one of them as a sole inspirer of human activity and to evaluate actions by that measure alone would be only to take a lopsided view of things. However, dharma, being the means of realizing artha and kama, is of prime importance. Then Dindayalji says, a lot of confusion is caused by equating dharma with religion or creed. Dharma really means those eternal principles
All
which
India
sustain
Radio
an
Archives
entity,
recording.
individual or corporate, and abiding by which that entity can achieve material prosperity in this world and spiritual salvation in the next. The basic attributes of dharma are eternal and immutable. But in the manner of a detailed spelling out of these principles, dharma does vary according to place and period. Nevertheless, in this changing world, dharma is the only factor that brings stability to society. According to Indian polity, therefore, absolute sovereignty is vested only in dharma. Society is not just a conglomeration of individuals. It is a living entity by itself. A society which has filial devotion to its own land and a characteristic genius of its own constitutes a nation. The genius is innate and inborn and not the product merely of geography and history. The rise and fall of nations depends very much on how their conduct has been in conformity with their own genius. But despite these variegated characteristics of theirs, different nations can play a complementary role in building up of world unity. If any nation does not do so and impairs unity, it should be considered a perversity. To seek to do away with nations in order to build up world unity would be like demolishing the individuality of the individual in the name of promoting corporate weal. He says this in the context of various thoughts of the time, many of which talked about world government and United Nations emerging as a kind of entity that will take charge of the whole world and nations may cease to exist. And this thought exists in many philosophies also. The ultimate vision of the revolution, Marxist revolution, was also that borders should be done away with and the world should all be united under one banner and the banner of revolution. However, the impracticality of that ideal is also explained in the philosophy of
This is
integral
All
humanism,
India Radio
which in fact
Archives
urges
recording.
nations to realize their own self-worth by practicing dharma, which is not religion, but is a philosophy of rightfulness. In order to manifest itself and to help the individual exercise these four purusharths, society gives birth to a variety of institutions such as marriage, family, property, caste, clan, community, guild, panchayat, state, etc. The state is important, but not supreme. In the Krita Yuga, they say, all men were guided by their conduct towards one another by dharma. So there was no need for state. That is our conception that the ideal state of society is stateless. This actually somewhere also conforms to again a Marxist notion that the state will eventually wither away. But instead of the state withering away as a result of material prosperity, Integral humanism seeks to explain this, saying that if we all follow our own dharma, that there will be no need for a state because every individual would be guided by the philosophy of dharma. In the Krita Yuga, they say all men were guided in their conduct towards one another by dharma, so there was no state. The concept of our ideal state of society is stateless and regulated entirely by dharma. This is possible only when everyone becomes selfless and dharmanist. But ordinarily, the institution of state is necessary to maintain order and assure every individual all opportunity for following his dharma. The ideal of the Indian state has been dharma rajya. Tolerance of and respect for all faiths and creeds is an essential feature of the Indian state. Freedom of worship and conscience is guaranteed to all, and the state does not discriminate against anyone on grounds of religion, either in the formulation of policy or its implementation. It is a non-sectarian state and not a theocracy. Dharma Rajya does not recognize any individual or body as a sovereign. Every individual is subject to certain obligations and regulations. Rights of the executive, of the legislature, as well as of the people are determined and regulated by dharma. Licentious conduct is not permitted. The nearest English equivalent of Dharma Rajya is rule of law. Dharma Rajya ensures, on the one hand, a curb on arbitrariness and totalitarianism, and on the other, it prevents democracy from degenerating into mobocracy. While other concepts of state are rights-oriented, the Indian concept of Dharma Rajya is duty-oriented. Naturally, therefore, there is no scope here for rights to be trampled upon or for any hankering after unlimited rights. Also, there is no danger of dereliction of duty, power madness, or any conflict of rights. In a Dharma Rajya, people's rights are inviolate. It is the duty of the people to guard these rights of theirs zealously, because it is through the exercise of these rights that they can fulfill their dharma. In fact, according to our concept, a right is an instrument which enables the individual to carry out his duties and experience a sense of being and belonging. Duty and right are thus two sides of a triangle which has dharma as its base. It is the right of a soldier to be equipped with arms, for without arms, he cannot fulfill his duty of defending the people. But how these arms are to be provided or used is a matter governed entirely by dharma. Then we come to democracy as part of integral humanism. Democracy, or people's rule, Loktantra, is a means for upholding Lokadhikar, people's rights, and promoting Lok Kartavya, people's duty. Democracy has to be established not only in the political field, but in the economic and social fields as well. In fact, democracy is indivisible. It cannot be viewed in fragments. The absence of democracy in any one sphere is bound to affect the growth of democracy in the rest. Tolerance, dignity of the individual, and a feeling of identification with demos, the people. These are essentials of democracy, which would be, without these, the mere paraphernalia of democracy would be purposeless. And if these essentials are there, the institutional form can vary from time to time and country to country. The main feature of political democracy is the right to elect representative rulers and to be elected as such. Freedom of occupation and free choice of goods are imperative for economic democracy. And social democracy arises from equality of status and opportunity. Efforts have to be made to ensure that all these rights complement one another and do not detract from the other's effects. For individuals as well as nations, freedom is a natural urge. In bondage, there is neither happiness nor peace. Along with political, economic, and social emancipation is also necessary. Non-interference by the state in the natural interests of the individual and society constitutes political freedom. Economic freedom lies in artha, not proving an impediment, positive or negative, for man's progress. Lastly, a condition in which society contributes to the individual's natural progress rather than restricts it is social freedom. These freedoms accrue to the individual only when the nation as such enjoys them. Like democracy, freedom too is indivisible. Without political freedom, it is impossible to have the other two freedoms. Without economic freedom, people cannot have social freedom, and to a great extent, political freedom also. And without social freedom, economic as well as political freedom will lose substance. As in the realm of politics, so in economic matters, laissez-faire belongs only to the Krita Yuga. It can have relevance only in such an ideal state. Ordinarily, therefore, to ensure proper production, distribution, and consumption of wealth, regulation of economy is necessary. For this purpose, a variety of institutions has taken shape. On the state, too, a heavy responsibility rests in this regard. But to vest the ownership and control of all means of production in the state would lead to centralization of economic as well as political power. See, this warning is very critical in the context of any discussion on socialism and Marxism, because this is the fundamental differentiation that is being sought to be made, that vesting the ownership and control of all means of production in the hands of the state would lead to centralization of economic as well as political power. This would be wrong. It must be, however, be admitted that to set the process of economic development moving, to keep economy on an even keel, and for the attainment of the nation's basic objectives, the state must undertake in general to plan, direct, control, regulate economic effort in certain specific spheres and in circumstances, to accept the responsibility of ownership and management too. And finally, I'm coming to the end of the description of the structure of integral humanism. For want of artha, dharma suffers. By its affluence, also dharma may suffer. In both circumstances, economic independence is curtailed. Non-availability of adequate livelihood or lack of capital necessary to maintain production or increase it constitutes want of artha. This applies both to the individual as well as to society. Attachment to wealth, forgetting the fact that wealth is but an instrument, lack of a dharma-regulated desire, knowledge and capacity for enjoyment of wealth, undue influence of money and wealth, economic disparities in society, inflation and devaluation, all these are conditions which connote an artha complex harmful to dharma. Such excess undermines human energy and ultimately leads to the dissipation of wealth and prosperity. So in essence, I have tried to demonstrate that the philosophy of integral humanism seeks to integrate individual worth with the worth of society. That to create a society that is harmonious and achieves all its key aspirations, it is necessary to abjure conflict and to be socially harmonious in its development and follow the rule of dharma, which has been very clearly laid down, which somewhere puts a kind of moral responsibility on society itself. Integral humanism minimizes the role of the state, which has been given the primacy in other philosophies, particularly socialism and communism. Let me just quickly go through the other subjects that are under discussion today, which in fact I think many of you may be more familiar with, because this is what is taught in most of our colleges, particularly for students of social sciences, history, political science, and so on. So having dealt with the integrating and unifying concept of integral humanism, let me turn to socialism and communism. Although similar in many ways, communism directly reflects the thoughts of Karl Marx, who outlined them along with his colleague Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto, 18 Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, and Theses on Feuerbach. They were further given shape by the writings of Vladimir Lenin, particularly in his State and Revolution. To make things easily comprehensible, I have tried to just take a table format to explain to you the differences are there in the theoretical understanding of and its practical implementation of socialism and communism. In philosophy, the critical element in communism is guided by the philosophy from each according to his ability to each according to his need. This is communism. In socialism, from each according to his ability to each according to his contribution or work. So, seen in the ideal communist state, the state will look after you according to your needs. Your needs may be greater than your neighbors, and you will be given that extra element, but from each according to his ability. This is common to both socialism and communism, but in communism, get according to your need, the state will provide, that is, and in socialism, the state will provide you only as a measure of how much you have worked, to which you will be entitled to wages or any other benefits that are entitled to you. Communism says free access to articles of consumption will be ensured by the state because there will be advances in technology which will allow for superabundance of society. In socialism, till that superabundance is achieved under communism, in socialism, the emphasis will be on profits being distributed among society or workforce to complement individual wages and salaries. In the communist economic system, the means of production are held in common, negating the concept of ownership in capital goods. Production is organized to provide for human needs directly without any use for money. Communism is predicated upon a condition of material abundance. The means of production in socialism are owned by public enterprises or cooperatives, and individuals are compensated based on the principle of individual contribution. All religion is abolished in communism, and metaphysics is rejected. In socialism, there's freedom of religion, but usually socialist states, despite saying that there is freedom of religion, promote secularism and discourage the practice of religion. Socialism actually can, in theory at least, coexist with different political systems. Most socialists, such as social democrats in Europe, advocate a participatory democracy. But the system under the participatory democracy, as you have seen in Western Europe, where social democratic parties have been in power, does not materially change from what it was under the capitalist system. Or when capitalist parties were in power, like say in Britain, you have the Labour Party, which had subscribed to the socialist philosophy, but now operates the system as it existed, very much the same way, with some differences from the Conservative Party, which is committed to a capitalist system of the economy. Both philosophies of socialism and communism believe that all people are equal and therefore no classes should exist. Government owns all means of production, including land, and people should work for the government, and collective output should be distributed equally. That's in communism. Under socialism, government will ensure access to the basic articles of consumption and public goods and allow for self-actualization. Large-scale industries are collective efforts, and thus the returns from these industries must benefit society as a whole. Free markets are discouraged in both systems. In the communist system, they shall not exist at all, whereas in a socialist system, some sectors are allowed private trade, but most sectors are under government control. The key element in both, however, is centralized planning, that the economy will be directed by a centralized planned mechanism, which we saw in what was the erstwhile Soviet Union, we've seen it in China, and to some extent it was prevalent in India also, when it was called a mixed economy, that the commanding heights of the economy were under state control, whereas other sectors were left in private hands. But there was a plan, and the planned system continues in some way or the other even today, that the resources and the projections are pooled in and things are distributed by authority organizations such as it was the Gosplan in the Soviet Union, it was a planning commission here. But in India, the planning commission was never really anything close to what the Soviet Gosplan was, which completely centralized the entire planning and distribution, which resulted in some hilarious things when the Soviet Union broke up, that a motor car's engine was produced in one factory and its tires were produced somewhere else. And then the Soviet Union broke up, so all tires were retained by one of the countries and all the engines went to another country. Now, of course, this nobody had visualized at that time, but that was what happened when there was centralized planning. And centralized planning is not necessarily inefficient, but can lead to inefficiencies if there is too much bureaucratization and centralization. That is what I was just trying to explain. Now, investment decisions and production are decided by a centralized planning body in socialism and communism. The problem is, very often, that these bodies are controlled by the political authority of the day. And then, if the political authority of the day is in itself a centralized authority and with very little accountability, then obviously a lot of things can go wrong. I'm not going into the details because I'm sure all of you know much about the economic structure of socialism and communism. But one thing that actually has led to the criticism of these isms and also probably led to their fall is the centralized nature of the government and the dictatorship of the proletariat. It was posited in Marxism that when you transit from one phase of history or one kind of economic order to the next, there has to be the system, political and economic system has to change. Just as you change from capitalism, then you move to socialism, and from socialism, the final stage of communism, when complete equality is achieved. In this transition period, instead of the so-called bourgeois system of democratic governance, which Marx and other socialists believed essentially meant rule of the elite, the rich, both agricultural and industrial, they determined the nature of politics. They chose political parties, they helped leaders get into place and positions of authority, and the working class was deprived of real power. So Marx believed that there had to be a revolution which will bring the working class to power, and the proletariat will then exercise dictatorship over the classes that it had overthrown. Because the proletariat was, in that sense, an overwhelming majority compared to those who were ruling them so far. Now, the dictatorship of the proletariat was a theory that was much acclaimed in its time, saying, yes, the working classes, the agricultural labor, they have been exploited. Now, they will in turn direct and dictate to the classes that have been overthrown. In the process, however, the dictatorship of the proletariat gradually became dictatorship of the party. And the party was the Communist Party, because that was said to be the vanguard of the revolution. They were to lead the revolution. They were to represent the aspirations of the proletariat. Again, it was theoretically a sound idea in its time, but over time it was shown that from dictatorship of the proletariat, it moved to dictatorship of a party, and then to the dictatorship of an individual. Now, when that happened, the party became subservient to an individual, the proletariat became subservient to the party, and the whole philosophical basis of socialism and communism that talked about equality in society and the abolition and creation of a classless society was gone. So this is where, you see, the whole fundamental differences between socialism and Marxism. In a sense, Marxism is a slightly confusing point here because it is really communism. Socialism is the previous stage of communism. You move from capitalism or a bourgeois democracy. History is supposed, according to Marx, to move to a stage of socialism. And from socialism, it transits to communism, which is supposed to be the final end of class struggle and class conflict. For a capitalist society in transition, the first step is socialism. From a capitalist system, it is easier to achieve the socialist ideal, where production is distributed according to people's needs. For communism, to distribute production according to needs, it is necessary to first have production so high that there is enough for everyone's needs. In an ideal communist society, people work not because they have to, but because they like. So that is supposed to be the transition. Bit unrealistic if you think about it, but in that sense, I don't know how many people really like to work. Some do, but most of them, people have to work because they have to. Socialism rejects a class-based society, but socialists believe that it's possible to make the transition from capitalism to socialism without a basic change in the character of the state. They hold this view because they do not think that the capitalist state as essentially an institution for the dictatorship of the capitalist class, but rather as a perfectly good piece of machinery which can be used in the interest of whichever class gets to command. So in other words, that there is a state mechanism. The state mechanism, it has the administration, it has various paraphernalia, the bureaucracy, and so on and so forth. Socialism believes that if you take over, or if a socialist party takes over this apparatus of the state, it can run it for the benefit of the underprivileged and for its own supporters and so on and so forth. In other words, the state machinery continues with a change in those who are commanding it or directing it. But in communism, and Marx is very clear about this, that you have to smash the existing system, the existing apparatus, because the apparatus has been built only for a certain section of society, and unless you break it and replace it by an alternative system, class society will not come to an end. Marx summarized the materialistic aspect of this theory of history known as historical materialism. This is where he explains this transition. In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into a definite relationship, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society. See, everybody is in a relationship with the means of production. The farmer is in a relationship with his means of production, namely his instruments, the hull. The worker has a relationship with the instruments or machines that he is running. This is Marxian ideal, that man is subservient to that means of production. He needs to use it to work that means of production in order to earn a living wage and earn for his family and so on and so forth. So there's a certain relationship that man enjoys has with the means of production, which are called the relations of production. A totality of these relations of production constitute the economic structure of society. the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. That is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. In other words, if you are a farmer, now your social existence, your equation with your village, your surroundings, your relations, that determines your consciousness, your worldview, how you think. For an industrial worker, similarly, the conditions in which you live, conditions in which you work, conditions in which you earn a wage, that determines how you think. And the collective thought process determines the society's superstructure. Laws, for instance. Society makes the laws that suit its present structure to maintain the status quo. Law is necessarily aimed at retaining the order in society, and that order necessarily favors those who are in command and control of society. This is the Marxian concept, which need not be and differs very strongly with the concept of dharma. Dharma, which has a morality inbuilt into it, that the practice of dharma is the practice of right and wrong. That differs from the Western concept of law, because the Western concept of law, there is something that is based on status quo, stating stability, which are, according to Marx and to an extent greatly correct, which are tilted in favor of those who run the machinery of the state. The base superstructure formulations took on a kind of canonical status in Marxist philosophy and orthodox Marxism, in particular in dialectical materialism. They also gave way to vulgar Marxism, which became plain economic determinism or economism, which has been criticized by various Marxist theories. I'm saying all this because I'm coming to a particular conclusion now. Vulgar Marxism was seen as little other than a variety of economic determinism, which the alleged determination of the ideological superstructure by the economical infrastructure. See, this was considered very crass. Many Marxists considered this very crass, that the economic situation determines your superstructure, your thought process, your legal system, and everything is determined by the economic relations of production. Many Marxists dismiss this as a very, very crass way of looking at the Marxist view. However, this positivist reasoning, which mostly based itself on Engels' later writings, in an attempt to theorize scientific socialism, an expression coined by Engels, has been challenged by Marxist theorists such as Antonio Gramsci or Althusser. They are late 20th century Marxist thinkers in France and Italy who tried to redefine Marxism in light of the experience of socialist governance in the Soviet Union, socialist bloc in China, and so on, where it said that things have gone horribly wrong. This is not what Marx meant. This dictatorship of the proletariat turning into dictatorship of the party, turning into the dictatorship of the individual, is not what Marx had meant, and Marxism is not incompatible with pluralist democracy. And this was defined in a whole new way by Althusser and Antonio Gramsci, but unfortunately by then Marxism was in decline, and I don't think that those ideas have ever been put to practice in any Marxist socialist state. So as a result, today what we find is that Marx is more relevant for philosophical studies, for philosophy classrooms, rather than in practice. In 1993, a French philosopher wrote, and I quote, "There is no Marxist philosophy, and there never will be. On the other hand, Marx is more important for philosophy than ever before." What he meant, that philosophers are going to now debate and discuss and dissect Marx and Marxist philosophy for decades, for centuries, but whether there was really a Marxist philosophy at all, he questioned. And very valid and I think pertinent question in light of all the experience the world has gone through in the 20th century. Well, then you see somewhere we come back to Marx's own query in this regard. One of Marx's famous writings, the Thesis on Feuerbach, point 11, the final line of Karl Marx's Thesis on Feuerbach, written in 1845, quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it." Whether Marx managed to do that, we don't know. I mean, jury is out on the judgment whether Marx at all managed to change it or only successfully interpret it, because there's no doubt that Marx's contribution to the interpretation of human history has been unparalleled. Marx's theories about society, economics, and politics, the collective understanding of which is known as Marxism, hold that human societies progress through class struggle, a conflict between an ownership class that controls production and a dispossessed laboring class that provides the labor for production. States, Marx believed, were run on behalf of the ruling class and in their interest, while representing it as the common interest of all. And he predicted that, like previous socio-economic systems, capitalism produced internal tensions which would lead to its self-destruction and replacement by a new system, socialism. He argued that class antagonisms under capitalism between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat would eventuate the working class's conquest of political power and eventually establish a classless society. Communism, a society governed by free association of producers. Marx actively fought for its implementation, arguing that the working class should carry out organized revolutionary action to topple capitalism and bring about socio-economic change. To conclude, I would say that there is very little in common between integral humanism, socialism, and communism or Marxism, because they are completely diverse approaches, not only to interpreting history, but to how society should be organized and conducted. They're all holistic philosophies, which have given ideas of how society should be organized and run, and on what principles they should be run. But because Marxism and socialism were also prescriptions for governance, they have probably undergone a lot of experimentation. Marxism and socialism have gone through myriad interpretations and reinterpretations. But it is no longer disputed that the socialist economic and political model which threatened to dominate the world through the 20th century has failed. Russia, which metamorphosed into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, has disintegrated. And in that country today, the market determines the economy, while multi-party democracy is its current political system. China has always been a misfit in the socialist bloc. Beijing experimented with what they called socialism with Chinese characteristics, and even one country, two systems, when they had, or still have actually, Hong Kong, where a capitalist system flourishes, and mainland China, which is governed by a communist system. Although the economy in China is still largely in the hands of the state, private business is permitted, and accumulation of private wealth is in fact encouraged, which flies completely in the face of the theories of socialism and communism. Only the political system in China is rigidly governed by the Communist Party, and hence it is a single-party dictatorship, the last remnant of the Marxist model. It is not my intention to make a value judgment today between the systems, but the failure of the socialist and communist system tells its own story. On the other hand, since integral humanism is not a prescription, it is not a prescription at all for the running of a state, but only a philosophy for integrating the individual with society for the common good of humankind, I would like to categorize integral humanism as an eternal philosophy. It is truly an eternal philosophy, and we are proud that it is part of the Indian tradition and Indian thought process. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your patient hearing, and I must thank All India Radio once again for inviting me and honoring me by asking me to deliver this lecture. Thank you.